Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Pei Hey 85 in Maseches Bava Basra. We are in the fifth parak where we have been discussing what is included in various sales. Let me share my screen and we'll fully get started. And so, in general, this chapter has addressed the sale of movable items for the most part. And for the most part, we've been discussing what's included in a sale when an item is sold without any additional specification. Yesterday, we transitioned to the steps one must take to complete an acquisition and be considered the owner of an item. We actually saw in Maseches Bava Metzia that most enokonos, that when you pay the money, it does not, God bless you, it does not actually cause the transaction to be completed. You actually need to take possession of it. And we offered a number of reasons why. The most classic understanding is that it's actually biblically it should work, but the rabbis were very concerned about what sellers would say. That sellers would say, "Oh yeah, you bought the wheat from me last week. Yeah, well, it all burned up in my attic." And so sorry about that, but it burned up after you bought it. And so as a result, people would get upset and there wouldn't be a kind of trust because you don't have that kind of trust in most of those situations. So as a result, in order to take possession, you needed to physically lift or drag the item and or acquire the location where it's located. And so only if you did that would you make the acquisition, and that would help keep us focused on the fact that if you don't actually see it, maybe it doesn't really exist. Mm-hmm. In any event, that's where we are at the moment. We're trying to understand now the nature of the transactions, and in particular, we're now going to talk about whether or not our vessels, the things that we own, can make acquisitions on our behalf. And we have what initially will appear to be a machlokes, which we'll see maybe really isn't. Because especially we have this machlokes is apparently between two sets of people who often disagree with each other. Meaning, let's go on and let's get started. Bottom line of Pei Dalet and Mabet, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking. Rav Shmuel, who usually are arguing, Da'amru Tavayu, but they both say the following as we turn to the top of Pei Hey Amid Aleph. Kalev Shel Adam, Konalo B'Kol Makom, Chutz Mirishus Harabim. That a person's vessels will acquire for him something in any location other than the public domain. So let's take a look at Rashbam. Rashbam will help us understand what we're talking about. Kalev Shaladam Shalogeyach, belonging to the purchaser. Konelo, they will acquire for him in pasak damim, if they've set aside the amount of money, b'kol makom, in any location, afilu b'rishus mocher, even at least at the moment it seems in the rishus of in the domain of the seller. V'kagon to amrle, and we're dealing with a situation where the seller says to the person, behedges specifically, yikaneh kaliyacha, that your kalim should be kone for you. Keda amr lekaman, as we will see as we go through today's daf. Bishmaisen in these cases. Aval bistama, but if you were to just say nothing, mi bailan lekaman below of shita. We'll see that we're going to ask the question where the owner does not say what the result is, does not say anything, and in that situation we are not going to resolve it. So the bottom line is that if I come to you and I bring my wheat to your home and you take a measuring cup and you scoop out the wheat that you want, because actually I pour it, because if you scoop it up, you're presumably lifting it, so that we won't deal with that because that clearly works. But you put your kalim, you put your measuring cup down, and I pour the wheat that, or the flour, whatever it is that I'm coming over to sell to you, I pour it into your vessel. Now, we were dealing with a seller's house. So you're the one who's selling to me, and I bring my vessel, my measuring cup, because I'm going to take it home. And you pour it into my vessel, even though that vessel is in your possession, is in your property. If you say that your vessel will be koneh for you, then my vessel, then it's fine. I have been koneh. And chutz min rishus harabim, the one exception is rishus harabim. And let's take a look at Rashbam again. End of the third line. Similarly, if we were not only in rishus harabim, but let's say we were in Ken's apartment, and so now I'm buying it from you, but the flour from you, and you pour it into my vessel in Ken's apartment, but we don't have any permission to be there. We don't have any permission to do the transaction there. Well, then that's just like if I were to do it in the public thoroughfare. There's no permission for me to put my vessels down, and so as a result, it's not going to be a valid transaction. As we will see momentarily, that we're going to have 4 different sets of measurements, 4 different rulings, and we're going to see what they are. There's a bit of a machlokas about it, but we'll be focusing on the Rashbam approach. Okay, so that's a position number 1. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So what about Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish? Again, those two people also, also would frequently argue. And yet, to Amri Tarbayu, they both say the following: Afilu b'rishus harabim. They say that even in the public domain, you can make an acquisition. So are they arguing on Rav and Shmuel? So Amar Rav Papa, lo pligi. No, actually, they're not arguing. So in second, but the words literally disagreed. One said that the person's utensil can make an acquisition in the public thoroughfare, and the other said you cannot. So how do we understand that? So kan b'rishus harabim, when Rav and Shmuel said that you cannot, that's talking about a true rishus harabim. Kan b'simta, and when Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said that you can, they were talking about in a simta. So let's take a look at Rashbam. Kan b'simta, ha deresh Lakish v'Rabbi Yochanan. So that position of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, that was specifically in a simta. Meaning, let's just remind ourselves what a simta is. A simta is effectively a side lot that is connected directly to Rishus Harabim, where you have the ability, it's sort of like a public parking, where you're allowed to pause for more than just a moment, right? It's a place where you can park, as opposed to the middle of the street, where except when you double park, which you're not allowed to do, you are not supposed to do it. So as a result, so we can really view it as sort of like the parking spaces on the side of a main thoroughfare. Those parking spaces you're allowed to stop in. And so as a result, if you and I, Stan, were to stop in one of those parking spaces, and I were to put my vessel down, and you were to pour your wheat into my vessel and say that and intend for me to take possession, and I have the similar intention, so then my vessel will take possession of the items for me. Wow. And I will, even if I haven't yet paid you the amount, we're talking about where I have set aside, we've decided on the price, I owe you the money. The transaction has completed, and the only thing that's due is the money to you. So, my karule rishus harabim. So, 1 second, why are Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish calling a simta a public domain? Why not call? After all, it doesn't seem like a public domain. She'ein rishus hayachid, because really, when we think about things in the Torah, we often distinguish only between the two extremes: rishus hayachid on the one hand, and rishus harabim on the other hand. These parking spaces along the side of the road, they're not rishus hayachid, and so therefore, even though they're not truly a Rishus Harabim, we're going to treat them like a Rishus Harabim. And
So how do you answer the Rashbam earlier when we said Chutz Reshut Rabim Hu Yadin Lachatzer She'eno Shel Shnehem? So and what you gave the example, it could be in somebody else's house. Well, you said my name, but that's not there's a difference between a third person's house and Reshut and Hu Adin She'eno Shel Shnehem. I'm thinking of Reshut Rabim as completely public, but to say it's in a third person's house is not even though it's not She'eno Shel Shnehem, it's still not Reshut Rabim.
That is true, but in both of those situations, and this is what we'll see is what is apparently the clear implication of the Gemara is: do I, as the customer, have permission and have the ability to pause where I am and put my vessel down? If I do,
no, I'm not asking that. I'm saying you're talking in a third person's house.
I understand, and I'm saying that just as in the public thoroughfare, in the main arteries of the public thoroughfare, I do not have permission to stop. So too, in a third party. Again, I only gave it as an example, your apartment, but it could have been Moshe's apartment. It could be any third party's apartment. The point is that if I don't have permission to be there and to put my stuff down, then it is just like a public thoroughfare. And that's what we're going to say. And let's take a look, and we'll see that that's exactly where we're going to go. So hachinami mistabra, and this also all makes sense. The Amar Rabbi Abahu, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and again, Rabbi Yochanan was one of the parties that we quoted. Kelyo shel Adam Konelo, a person's items can acquire for him. But anywhere where he has permission to put the item down. So, yesh lo reshus in. The implication is if he has the permission, he can put it down and acquire things. Ein lo reshus lo. If he doesn't have permission, then he cannot. And take a look at the Rashbam continuing. Kol makom, we'll take a look at those two Rashbams. Kol makom, the second line of the narrow lines in the Rashbam. Kol makom sheyesh lo reshus kagon simta, right? Like a simta. V'chatzar hashutafin. And also, if the two of us, if Stan and I are partners in a piece of property, in both those situations, both in the simta, both in those parking spaces along the side of the Rishus Harabim, and in any property that we jointly own, v'rishus mocher, or in Stan's property, v'kagon to Amrle Zil Knei, and it's because he tells me to come and make a kinyan, as we will see, come on, dahainu yesh lo rishus. All three of those situations, a simta, shared property of the two of ours, or a situation where I'm in the seller's property, but he's explicitly given me permission. All three of those situations, I have permission, and therefore my vessel will work. Ein lo rishus, if I don't have permission, could go in rishus harabim, like in rishus harabim, or we could also say a property that belongs to a third party where the third party has not given you permission. In all those situations, then the answer is low. So shma mina, indeed, that's exactly what we learned. Now, Tosfos here asks an interesting question. So let's take a look. Let me just make sure.
But isn't Reshut Rabim owned by everyone? So why would he not? From whom would he need to get Reshut? The government?
You would need, no, that is part of the problem. There is no one that you can ask, but technically, potentially, you could potentially ask if it's a Jewishly owned space, then the community is supposed to appoint a group of people who will be responsible. But you are right to raise the issue that who does he ask from? And that is part of the problem. That is why he can't get permission. And of course, we are distinguishing between two parts of Rishus Harabim. There's one part of Rishus Harabim that we say he can't get permission because there's no one to ask, and that's talking about the main thoroughfare of Rishus Harabim. But again, in a simta, which is also part of Rishus Harabim, certainly not called Rishus Hayachid, we would say say that that's a place where we do allow him to stop, and therefore you would be able to. You don't have to ask anybody permission because it's considered available for everyone. But let's take a look at
But
Tosfos.
we do ask for a shoot, for instance, from the government if there's a parade like the Israel parade or a neighborhood festival or a food festival. They do ask, and the police come and set up barricades. So you can ask permission to use the Reshut Rabim.
Yes, yes, certainly in the modern world, we have some ability to do that, and I'm sure that even in ancient times there were those kind of parades. I doubt that there was an Israel parade in the most of our Jewish history as to where we were. But the point is that you know we're dealing with a stam situation, you know, an ordinary course situation. In the ordinary course, you don't have permission. In the ordinary course, the seller gives you permission. So yes, that's a piece of what we're talking about. Now, Tosfos highlights that yesterday we said something a little bit different. V'im tomar b'hada amar le'el. We saw yesterday madad v'hiniyach al gavi simta, that if in fact you measure and you put it on in a simta, well, then kana v'ukimna lato kupato, and we said that we're dealing with the buyer's vessels. So mashma dafka madad. The implication is that you specifically have to measure. So I don't understand. We're now saying aval lo madad lo kana, and if you didn't measure, you wouldn't be acquire lo kana lo Caleb. His vessels wouldn't acquire for him. So why over here does it seem like it's sufficient to just put it in the vessel and you don't have to do any measurement? V'omeri to buy lamemer, that this is coming to teach us zilkani, that if the seller says go and acquire, you know, make a kinyan, then that's enough. The kavan demadad, but and you don't need to measure. But in the earlier case, since you measured, kida amrlei zilkani dami, it's as if the seller said go and make a kinyan. So there are two ways that you can that a seller can tell the buyer, listen, even though we're in my domain, you can go ahead. We're in my property. You can go ahead and make a kinyan. I can do it explicitly, or I can do it implicitly by saying, okay, go and measure the amount that you want. That shows that I have intention for you to be able to take. Okay, so now we're going to, where did we end up here? We ended up with the following issue. We ended up with saying that that a vessel cannot make an acquisition in the public domain. So they can in a simta, but not in a public domain. So now the Gemara is going to quote a brisa that is going to suggest that maybe a vessel can make an acquisition even in the public domain. So Tashma, Arba midos b'mochrin, and that's the purpose that we're going to quote a long brisa. We'll see at one point in the brisa, we'll raise that point. It'll appear that you can make an acquisition with your vessels in the public thoroughfare, and that's the point that we're going to use as a question on ourselves. So arba midos b'mochrin, there are four kinds of. So here, there's a number of different ways that you can read the word midos here. Measurements, because we're dealing with a situation where you're actually measuring, but it also could be rulings, for conclusions. So, but in any event, the point is that there are four situations. So what are those four situations? So Rashbam explains what they are, and we're going to, but it's not the only way. Indeed, Rashbam notes that there are a couple of ways that you can understand it. So let's jump to the Rashbam. There's a very long quote from the Gemara, but then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines up in the narrow lines of the Rashbam, uperish arba midos b'mochrin, and that what does it mean that there are four categories? Lav arba reshuyas kachashiv. Don't think that it refers to the four kinds of property, that the property would be 1, reshus harabim, 2 would be reshus mocher, 3 would be reshus lokeach, and 4 would be Rishus Hamufkadin, Etzlo, that the property that belongs to somebody who is watching over the items being sold. Daha Rishus Mocher, Rishus Nifkad Chadahu, because those would not result in 4 different categories of rulings. They would have 3 categories of rulings, because the 3 categories, the rule for a Rishus Nifkad is the same, the person who's watching it is the same as the person who is the seller's possession. So Dahacha Vahacha Shayak Lameimar Kabla Veschiras Makom Vahotzav Agba. In all both of those cases, there are 4 different ways that you can make an acquisition. You can you can borrow the location, you could rent the location, you can take the item out of the location, and you can lift the item. All 4 of those will work. Daha Tanan b'masnizin gabi rishus mocher schiros makom. That because when in our Mishnah, when we talked about taking possession, taking ownership of something in the property of the seller, we said that renting the location works. The Katani, the Imahaya Pikeach, if he was wise, Sokaras Makomo, he would just rent the location. Kimna Barashus Balam, and we said that was talking about when you're in the property of the original owner, namely the seller. The Kavan did Dinan Shaveh, and because the rule is equivalent for the property of the seller and the property of the watcher, Leica Arba Midos, that we don't end up with 4 different rules. Umahain Arba Midos. So what do I think the 4 Midos are? Arba Chalukin Sheldinin. It's the 4 different categories of rules. Shachalukim Zemizeh, that are each different from one another. The Eluhain, and these are they. So 1 is Mida She'ena Shel Shnehem. If you use a measuring cup that does not belong to either of the parties of the transaction, B'Rishus Harabim U'B'Chatzar She'ena Shel Shnehem, and you do that in the Rishus Harabim or in a property that doesn't belong to either of them. Da'amrinan ba, because we say with respect to it, Ad Shalonis Muleta Hakmida L'Mocher, that until the measuring cup becomes full, then it all still belongs to the seller. Mishnit Malet Hamida, but once the measuring cup becomes full, Lolokeach, now it belongs to the buyer. So that's Hareyachat. That is all one category, and we will see that inside in a moment. Categories 2 and 3, Mida Shelecha Mehen, that if it belongs to either one of them. So there could be belonging to the buyer or to the seller. In each case, Rishon Kana, that every little bit that you pour in continues to belong to, or now belongs to, the buyer. So if it's a seller's item, so then it continues to belong to the seller until the item is full, or until he says that he's allowing it to be for the other party. So Harei Shtayim, that's 2 more. So that's categories number 2 and 3.
How do you get 2 and 3?
Well, if the measuring cup belongs to the buyer, it's number 2, and if the measuring cup belongs to the seller, it's number 3. Because in each case, the stuff that's put into them continues to belongs to the owner of the measuring cup. So that's a different rule than the last one, where of course it didn't belong to the owner of the measuring cup because it was a third party's measuring cup. So Rishus Lokeach. So now Miyad Shekibel Mocher Kana Harei Gimel. So that's 2 more where the Rishus of the Lokeach accepts it from the seller, and so again now we have 3 categories. Okay. One second. Hold on. Maybe I got that wrong. 1 second. So, 1 second. So category number 2 is where I'm sorry. So category number 2 is where it belongs to either of them. And the rule is that it continues to belong to the person who owns the vessel. And then Rishus Lokeach, where it's in the property of the seller, Miyad Shekibel Mocher, Kana, and then
is the buyer.
I'm sorry. My apologies. I meant, even though my head was saying even though I was saying seller, I meant buyer. You're absolutely right. The Rishus Lokeach Miyad Shekibel Mocher Kana Hare Gimel. So the third category is that if the seller goes into the property of the buyer, then as soon as the seller agrees on price and the terms with the buyer, the property of the buyer will make the acquisition from the seller. That's going to be category number 3. And category number 4 is Rishus Mocher, Rishus Nifkad. If you're in the property of the seller or the third party watcher, din hagba v'hotza v'kabala v'schiros. That in that property there are 4 different ways that you can make an acquisition: by lifting, by taking out, by borrowing the space, or by renting the space. Hare arba. So now we end up with 4 different categories. Samach matzati li midivrei Rabbeinu Zikani Ma'alo Kvodo. And I found that from the words of I think it's referring to his grandfather, presumably Rashi, that he said something similar. Okay, so let's go, and now let's take a look at the items.
The 4 items are Schirut Makom, Hotza Hagba, and what? Kabbalah?
And Kabbalah, correct. Those are the 4 different ways. Now, those are not the 4 rulings that because it's very confusing, because there are a number of 4s. There are 4 different properties that it could be. There are 4 different ways that you can make an acquisition in the property that belongs to the seller or the nifkad, or the person who's watching it. And those 4 that you mentioned are the 4 different ways that you can make an acquisition in the property of the seller or the third party who's watching it. And we're going to see that we're going to be dealing in those situations where the vessel that you're using does not belong to the buyer. And so as a result, that's not a proof one way or the other with respect to the question of a buyer's vessel in the seller's property. But let's take a look.
What about the buyer's property? Because you mentioned now the seller or the nifkad, but
yes, that's category number 4. Category number 3 was the buyer's property.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So I have it not incorrect on my screen. I'm going to need to clarify it in the update that I will do. So let's for my own records. But let's now go through it. So now we've done it in the Rashbam. Let's go inside. So Tashma, Arba Midas B'Mokra. There are 4 categories of people who are selling. Ad Shalonis Mala Mida L'Mocher. As long as the measurement's not full, so that then it continues to belong to the seller. Mission is Male Mida L'Lokech. And if it is now full, it belongs to the buyer. And B'Medvarim Amurim, what is the situation that we're talking about? That situation is B'Mida She'ena Shel Shneim, where the measurement cup does not belong to either of them. But if in fact it belonged to either of them, Rishon Kana, then then each little bit that gets put into the measuring cup gets acquired. So now we have 2 rules. B'Medvar Mamurim, and when was all of this true? This is all true b'rishos harabim u'v'chatzar she'ena shel shnehem. When we're dealing with the possession, with the public thoroughfare, and a courtyard that doesn't belong to either of them. Now that's the language that we're quoting. This is the key piece, because you would think from reading this that in Rishus Harabim that we would say Rishon Kana if I use my own vessel. But we're going so, but we said a few moments ago, right? We said that everybody agrees that in Rishus Harabim, no, your vessel cannot make an acquisition for you. So that's the language that we're going to quote in another moment. Again, we're going to refresh that language, and we're going to highlight that doesn't that show that that's a that is that contradicts what we said earlier, because again, what we said earlier is that your vessels cannot acquire in Rishos Harabim, and now we're saying that your vessels can acquire in Rishos Harabim. So that's category number 2. Category number 3, Abal Berishos Mocher, when it comes to the possession, to the property of the seller, Lo Kana Achiyig Bayana. Then it does not acquire, the buyer doesn't acquire the property until he lifts it up, O Achiyotzieno Murashuso, or until he takes it out of the property. Berishus Lokeach, what about when it's in the property of the buyer? Well, then, Kevan Shekibel Alav Mocher, since the seller has agreed to sell it, Kana Lokeach, then the buyer immediately acquires it. And we're going to see that, well, let's take a look at the Rashbam. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 lines up, middle of the line, in the wide lines at the bottom of Pei Hey Amud Bet in the Rashbam. Kana Lokeach, miyad, immediately. Afal pi shelo madad, even though you didn't measure it. Dekani le rishuso, because his property acquires it for him. Va'afal pi shahamida shel mocher, and even if the measuring cup belongs to the seller, dahakli batal etzel harishus, that we would say that the vessel is nullified in the possession of the property owner. Umihu, however, we're going to see in a moment, Likame, shortly, Muki Labamida de Lokek. In the end, we're going to say that this is actually potentially dealing with the measurement cup of the buyer, the lo garam imashach, and therefore it's no worse than if you did Mashicha, the lo madad, and you didn't do measurement. De Katani Masnisan Dekana. Our Mishnah says that works. So in the end, we're not going to have a definitive proof of anything broader, but it does seem that Rashbam would say that if you use even if you use the vessel of the seller, it should work. Okay, Birishus Hala. So that, what about Hamufkadim Etzlo? What about if you use the property of the person who's got the deposit, who's holding it as a deposit? Now this ends up, even though now maybe you would say that this is a 5th category. So Rashbam has told us already that this category is identical to the category of the property of the mocher. So lo kana achi yikabil alav. So then the buyer does not acquire the produce, the product being sold, until the custodian accepts on himself to loan the place where the buyer rests to the buyer. O achi yiskor es mekoman, or until the buyer rents the place from the custodian. And so let's take a look at the last Rashbam on the daf. It begins at the top, at the 6th line from the bottom of the Rashbam, at the very end of the line. Achi kabbalah nifkad b'mitzvahs mafkid liyached lo rishus lelokeach, that until he accepts that and who are we talking about? We're talking about the person who accepted the responsibility to watch over the item that's being sold. And he specifically sets aside part of his property to the buyer, liknos haperos, in order to buy the fruit, basher husham, in the location where it's located, or alternatively, osha yiskor v'hua, or he rents it, v'hua din nami gabi rishos mocher. And these 2 different methods of acquiring also apply in the property of the seller. Shayach Kabbalah B'Skiras, that both the acceptance and the rental apply in this situation also. V'hachinami, and here as well, when it comes to the watcher, the nifkad, the person who accepted the custodian, Shayach Hagba v'hotza. Similarly, the buyer has the ability to lift it up the item or take it out of the watcher's property. Elatana orcha de milsa. but rather we learned what is the ordinary course, Katani. That's exactly what we learned. Distam mocher, that usually the seller, kisha mocher, when he sells something, rotzehu lifnos his beito, he wants to empty his house. And so hilkach Kitani Hasam Hagba Vahotza. And therefore, when it came to the seller's property, we focus on lifting and taking out. Because he doesn't want to lend out any space in his property, because he wants that space to put new property for sale. And he doesn't want to rent his property because, again, he wants to use that property to make new sales. V'gabi nifkad, but when it comes to the watcher, shayach kabbalah v'schiros, then lending the space or renting the space makes sense, because the kihechi shahaya nifkad shelzeh harishon, just as he rented out or was watching the items for the first guy, hachinami yishmar b'kedono shel sheni, he'll watch over the items for the second guy. Virabusatana. And the point is that we are just learning something extra. Haka Kabbalah V'schirus, that we brought this category in order to tell us the categories of Kabbalah and Schirus. V'kol shekain hakbavotza. And certainly lifting and taking out of the possession of the watcher would constitute a way of the buyer making an acquisition. Ulaman demoki lekaman bimane democher, and according to the one who says that we say that this is dealing with the vessel of the seller, be mocher, in the house of the seller, umani delokeach be lokeach, and we're dealing with this vessel of the buyer in the home of the buyer, ikala ukme nami bimani demufkat. We could even say that here in this third party's house, where it's the watcher, that we're dealing with the vessel of the watcher, bein mufkad, in the house of the watcher. V'hilkach lo kani lo keach b'kelev denifkad. And therefore, the buyer is not going to be able to make an acquisition through the kalim of the watcher. And so therefore, you have to do one of the four things. You have to either borrow the space, rent the space, lift the item up, or take the item out. Okay. So now, all right. So now
that would be a case of sort of a case of Mashiach velo madad, because he can't use the
absolutely.
vessel.
These are all cases of many of these cases are cases of lo madad. So you're absolutely right. So, but the whole point of bringing this entire brisa, now we highlight Katani Miha,
and it seems to be that this seems to be that this nifkad has a business. He's renting and say his space. It's a good deal for him. He's had a business renting space.
Yes, exactly, 100%, and he's willing to rent the space to whomever. So just because the buyer, when the buyer now takes possession, he's just as happy to rent the space to the buyer as he was to rent the space to the seller. That's exactly what the Rashbam was saying. So Katani Mia birashus harabim v'chatzer she'enu shel shneihem. But 1 second, what did we say? We said that a buyer's utensil, because we were dealing with, again, the situation was im haita mida shel echad mihen, that if the measuring cup belonged to one of them, we said that we're dealing with a situation where it can make an acquisition as each little bit is poured in the public domain or in a courtyard that doesn't belong to either of them. So how can that be? So as we turn to pay hey amud bet, my lav b'rishos harabim mamish, doesn't this really refer to an actual rishos harabim and not simply to a simta? No, lo simta. We can say it refers to a simta. Well, 1 second, b'hadumya dechatzar she'ena shel shneim katani. But 1 second, the better way of explaining a simta, the better way of determining what is meant by the public thoroughfare is something that should be identical or similar to a chutzner that doesn't belong to both of them. Well, what's true about a chutzner that doesn't belong to either Stan or me It's that I don't have permission to put my vessel there as the buyer. So too, when we talk about a Rishus HaRabim, shouldn't we say that the Rishus HaRabim that we're talking about is a Rishus HaRabim where I don't have permission to put my vessel down, which would refer to a true public thoroughfare rather than to a simta? So the Gemara answers, no. My chotzer she'ena shel shneim nami delo dahai kula ulelo dahai kula ela detarvaihu. When we say when we're saying that the courtyard does not belong to either of them, what we mean is it doesn't belong to either of them individually. But rather it belongs to both of them together. And so as a result, just as I do have permission to put my vessel down as the purchaser in a simta, I also have permission to put my vessel down in the courtyard that belongs to both of us. And so therefore, everything works. Okay, so
didn't we mention this before when we said shutfim? Why is that different from earlier in the Gemara?
This is not a new rule. Remember that we brought this question because of the language of the Brisa. And what we've essentially done is reread the Brisa to make it consistent with the rules that we've already said. 100%. That's exactly right. So now we've dealt with that, and we've dealt with all the problems, and so we are in a good position. So where do we end up? Again, so where we have ended up is that my utensil can work in any place where I have permission. So now, boy mine Rav Sheshus me Rav Huna, Kalev shalokeach b'reshus mocher. If I have my utensil in the property of somebody else, kana lokeach olo. Do I acquire it or not? So let's take a look at how Rashbam understands this question. Kalev shalokeach b'reshus mocher. Kagon pasak v'nasan l'toch mida. We're dealing with a situation where it's already been determined what the price is. That's what pasuk refers to. V'nasan l'toch mida and shalokeach, and now it's been put in the measuring cup of the lokeach. Omadad b'mida shalo, or it was measured in the seller's measuring cup. The shavchan l'kelev shalokeach, and now is put into the vessel of the purchaser. Vehevi shalmocher hu, v'habayis shalmocher hu, and the house belongs to the seller. So what do we say? So do we say kana lokeach, that keilu nasan l'tok reshuso shalokeach? It's as if you put it into the item that belongs to the lokeach. Oh, lo kana. Or do we say no? The reshus ikar, that the owner of the property is the core. The hakli and the vessel, batal legabe harishus, and the vessel is nullified relative to the property. So Amrlei Tanisua. Well, 1 second. Doesn't the following Mishnah show us the answer? Because Rakola Latocheka, when it comes to a divorce, this is a Mishnah in Maseches Gittin, Daf Ayin Zayin, Amud Aleph. If you throw it into her lap, Oloto Kalta, or into her basket, Harezu Megoreshes, then she's divorced. And so what do we see? If we see that she's divorced, even though presumably that basket is actually in the property of the husband. And so as a result, even though she's not in her, her vessel is in somebody else's property, we allow it to make an acquisition. So isn't that a good proof? Well, Amrlei Rav Nachman says, my time of pashtos milei mehahi. Why are you making a proof from there? There have been 100 blows to that proof. Because listen to all the different counter proofs that we have in this. Da'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, because Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, that we're talking about a situation where the basket was actually hanging from her, and so as a result, it's like putting it directly into her hand. But Reish Lakish Amar, and Reish Lakish said, Kshura, actually, it could just be connected to her, even if it's not hanging, meaning that he doesn't think you need it to literally be hanging from her. As long as it's connected to her and tied to her, well, then it's like her hand. And Rav Ada Barahava Amar Kagon Shahaisa Kalta Munachas La Ben Yerchosea. We're dealing with a situation where the basket was resting between her thighs, meaning that it was right, it was where she was sitting. And so again, that is maybe considered something different. Rav Masharshia Braid the Rebbe Ami Amar Kagon Shahaya Bala Mocher Klosos, that we're dealing with a situation where the husband sells baskets. And the Rashbam explains that because the husband sells baskets, we're going to, he doesn't care that she also stores her basket with him. And Rabbeinu Gershom explains that actually we're dealing with a situation where she bought the basket from her husband, and therefore the husband doesn't care that she keeps the basket with him. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Makom Cheka Kanuya, that the property, the place that she's occupied with her lap, it belongs to her. Mokom Kalta Kanuila, and the place that her basket is belongs to her. So Amarava, my time with the Rabbi Yochanan. Why does Rabbi Yochanan say that the woman's stuff in its place belongs to the woman? Lefisha ein adam makbid al lo al makom cheka v'lo al makom kalta, because a husband does not object to the location, where his wife sits and where his wife puts her sewing basket. That's just not the way husbands are supposed to act, at least. Ella pashut la somaha. So as a result, Rav Nachman has highlighted that you cannot prove from the case of the divorce anything about an ordinary buyer's vessel in the property of the seller, because all of those other situations have dealt with special permission. Ela pshut la meha, but rather resolve it from the following. Birshus mocher. And again, what we're essentially saying is this is a situation where there was no statement of kanila. There was no statement of go and measure. There was no implication of measurement and go and acquire. And there was no implication of measuring, and therefore it belongs to you. But rather, we're dealing with a situation where effectively the seller has said, I'm not giving you any rights in my property. Do we still allow the buyer's vessel to make an acquisition? So we're going to try from the following. Let's say we should resolve it from the following. Birshus mocher, in the property of the seller, lo kana achiyag biena o achiyotziena mirshuso. Well, what did we say in the brisa, the long brisa that we quoted? We're going to now quote it again. We said that the buyer doesn't acquire produce in the property of the seller until he lifts it or removes it. And of course, we said also, and the Rashbam has highlighted, that similarly renting the space or borrowing the space would work. So my la bekelev delokeach, aren't we talking about in that situation the buyer's utensil? And yet, even though it's in the buyer's utensil, the buyer has not acquired it until he lifts it or removes it from the property. So, no, you don't have to say that we're dealing with the buyer's utensil. But Kelya de Mocher, we can say that we're talking about the seller's utensil. 1 second. Bekelya de Mocher. Once you tell me that the brisa, the first case of the brisa, is talking about the seller's utensil, so we should say that the later case in that brisa should also be talking about the seller's utensil. So, but let's look at that second case. What do we say? In the property of the buyer, as soon as the seller has accepted upon himself the terms of the sale, the buyer makes the acquisition. And if you tell me that it's the seller's utensils that are holding the item, why should the buyer acquire something? Meaning, if I walk into your property wearing my backpack, or I put my backpack down on your property, you do not acquire everything in my backpack automatically, even if I'm there to sell you the stuff that's in my backpack. it doesn't go to you because you don't own my backpack. Seifa, so as a result, Seifa atan lekelyu de lekech. No, so we're going to say that this latter case is dealing with where it was the buyer's utensil. But now the Gemara asks, 1 second, umay paska. Let's take a look at the Rashbam. Why are you making this difference? Ki pasakta, that you ruled as hadavar kain. I'm sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines down in the medium lines of the Rashbam, and it says umay paska that ki pasakta as hadavar kain dila olam be mocher ein modedin ki'im bekelav democher ubelo keach the bekelav delokeach bitmia. What was the basis for you to say that when we're dealing with the house of the mocher, we're going to only measure in the vessels of the mocher, and when we're dealing with the house of the buyer, we're going to only use the measure in the vessel, only use the vessels of the buyer? So why are we making that distinction? Because stama de milsa. So the Gemara explains that that's the ordinary case, right? Bei mocher, mani de mocher, shchiche. When you're in the house of the seller's utensils are what are around. And when you're in the house of the buyer's utensils are all around. So we have now again left ourselves with no answer to the question. We do not know whether a buyer's utensil can make an acquisition for sure in the seller's property. Now, again, if you have permission to put it there, well, then it's like you're borrowing the location, and that we say is fine. But if you don't, what's the story? And so for our continued efforts on that front, you will need to stay tuned for tomorrow's daf.
Why would we say, Sistama de Milta, why would we say it's so unusual for a buyer to bring his pot or his bag to the seller's house? You're going shopping, and you bring your utensil to collect the wheat, the vegetable, the squash, the pickles, whatever you want to buy, and you take it home with you. That doesn't seem. That would seem common to say that stama de milsa. It's in the only in the house of the mocher. You use the kessels, the kelim of the mocher, and not the buyer. I don't know why we have to say stama de milta.
Okay, so excellent question, and the way I would say is the following. The point is that first of all, let's talk. We can speak from an environmental perspective. We can speak from a historical perspective. The people were extraordinarily poor, so in general, often you would need to borrow the vessels of the seller in order to get the property home. So that's point number one. So I think, of course, in our modern sensibilities, it does seem like you would usually bring the vessels. And indeed, of course, in today's world where we use recycled baskets, that's exactly the case. But of course, remember that 20 years ago, if you went to shopping, you would use the vessels. You would take your items home in bags that were provided to you by the seller. So
now you have to pay for them in New York anyway.
No, now you have to pay for them.
Right, now in New York, right. Years ago you did not. But
years ago you didn't have to pay for them. Exactly, that's my point. So that's point number one. Point number two is it is not, the point of this Gemara is not at all to say that it's impossible. It is rather to say that that we cannot say for sure that the vessels that are being used are the vessels of the purchaser. And indeed, for any one purchaser, if we look at all of the vessels that are in the home of the seller at the moment of the sale, the vast majority of them belong to the seller. And so as a result, you're right. The buyer could have brought a vessel. But if we're looking at the overall likelihood of what vessels we're talking about, we have to recognize that the multiplicity of the vessels that the seller would have in his own home suggests that maybe it was the seller's vessel. Again, it's not necessarily to make it definitive. Remember, all that we're trying to do is disprove the effort to prove that our Baraisa has to be that we're dealing with the vessel of the buyer. And once we've said, well, it could have been the vessel of the seller, and we've explained how there's a logic to how there's a, I'm sorry, my apologies, how there's a logic to what our rejecting read of the brisa, that there's a logic to that read that rejects the brisa answering our question. Well, then we've resolved the question, meaning we can't make a definitive proof. That's what the Gemara is trying to do here, right? The Gemara is trying to make a definitive proof that it must be the property of the it must be the utensil of the vessel of the buyer. And in the end, we're saying that no, it does not have to be the vessel of the buyer, and therefore we do not have a definitive answer to our question.
All right.
Okay, so I think from all those different perspectives, we can understand this Gemara. Again, if we focus on it from a historical perspective, I think that there's probably truth to what the Gemara is saying. But again, more importantly, maybe, is the fact that the Gemara is just trying to show that your effort to prove that it must be the buyer's vessel is not, in fact, the case. I'm sorry, that it must be the buyer's vessel must, and therefore that a buyer's vessel in the seller's domain is going to make an acquisition must be true, or does not make an acquisition must be true. So in the end, we say, no, it doesn't have to be that. It could be that actually it is consistent with the buyer's vessel being able to make an acquisition in the seller's domain.
In the seller's domain, the buyer, what?
Right. The question, let's go through. The question,
the buyer,
let me clarify. So the question that Gemara asked is, does a buyer's vessel in the domain of the seller work to allow the buyer to make an acquisition? So, right. Rav Nachman said that the answer is no, it does not work, because the brisa, the long brisa that we quoted, specifically said that when you're in the seller's domain, the only way you can make an acquisition is by lifting or taking out or renting space or borrowing space. So, right. So doesn't that show that the buyer's vessel cannot make an acquisition? And our response is no. Maybe that brisa, when we're dealing with the a seller's domain, is talking about where the item is in the seller's vessel, and therefore it does not tell us anything about whether or not a buyer's vessel will work.
Okay, we just don't know.
Exactly. Okay, have a wonderful day. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.
Well, the Gemara at some point, I mean, I don't know, maybe we're done with the sugya, but if not...
No, we still are going to be trying to prove.
So I'm wondering if the Gemara will say teku to this.
Yeah, we'll leave it as a cliffhanger, and God willing, get the answer tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.
Okay.